At just 15 years old, a girl's life was violently shattered by a stranger who severed her arms, brutally assaulted her, and left her for dead. Abandoned in a desolate canyon and losing blood, she somehow managed to survive. Years later, her attacker would strike again, but it wouldn't be her on the receiving end. This is the story of Mary Vincent. Little is known about Mary's childhood. Throughout the interviews she gave, she was selective with what she talked about, perhaps due to privacy reasons. However, there are certain details we do know. Mary was raised in Las Vegas within a military family and was the middle child of 7 children. She was a youth lead dancer for a prestigious cabaret called the Lido de Paris, but she liked breaking her parents' rules, and she frequently skipped school. At the age of 15, one of her sisters warned her that their father was coming home with a migraine and a rage directed towards Mary. She became fearful and decided to run away from home. Once she ran away, Mary left Las Vegas and traveled to California. She went from place to place, constantly searching for something to call home. Some nights were spent in the car of a boyfriend near San Francisco, until he was arrested for the rape of another teenage girl. Other nights were spent behind trash cans, in the back seats of unlocked cars, and in the home of an uncle just outside of Santa Cruz. Mary became lonely, which quickly evolved into homesickness. On September 29, 1978, she stood on the side of the road with her mind made up. She intended on hitchhiking nearly 400 miles to Corona, California, where her grandfather lived. On the same day, a man driving a blue van pulled over next to Mary, who was accompanied by 2 other hitchhikers. The driver's name was Lawrence Singleton, an overweight and balding man, and according to Mary, he was a grandpa-type figure. The van was noticeably empty with space for all 3 of the hitchhikers, but Singleton insisted on only taking Mary. Eager to reach California, Mary dismissed the concerns of the other hitchhikers. She ignored the 2-gallon milk jugs he filled with alcohol before hitting the road, and him drinking from them as they headed towards the I-58. She ignored the way he tried to pull her closer before she moved out of his reach, and figured he was just being nice when he put his hand on her neck to check her temperature after she sneezed. Disregarding all the red flags, she settled in and fell asleep. When she woke up, it was dark outside, and she began to panic. When she looked outside the window, the road signs showed they were headed toward Nevada, the opposite direction. Mary felt around her seat until her hands touched a sharp stick. She pointed it at Singleton and demanded he turn the vehicle around. Singleton claimed he simply made a mistake and started driving back in the right direction, only for him to soon pull over for a bathroom break. Mary stepped out of the vehicle to stretch her legs, and she noticed her shoe was untied. She bent over to tie her shoe, losing sight of Singleton. Mary didn't see him coming behind her, or the sledgehammer that was now in his hands. Mary regained consciousness in the back of the van, having been rendered unconscious. She was tied up, completely undressed, with Singleton hovering over her. He began raping her, over and over. Singleton ignored her cries, her pleas to be set free, and her promises not to tell anyone. He only stopped to rest briefly or to drive to a nearby canyon, each time returning to assault her once again. Mary remained awake throughout, unable to break free from her restraints, even as her attacker was asleep. That morning, Singleton pulled Mary out from the back seat. With a hatchet in hand, he swung it 3 times, severing her left arm just below the elbow. Singleton then started cutting into her right arm, this time taking much longer. When he was finished, she laid there with both of her arms now severed and her blood spilling all over the pavement. She could see Singleton flicking his arm back and forth, but she didn't understand why. That was until she saw her right arm, severed, still in a death grip around Singleton's arm. While Mary was still on the ground, Singleton picked her up and tossed her off the edge of the road, sending her plummeting off a 30-foot canyon cliff. He then climbed down after her and stuffed her into a nearby drainage culvert. 4 of her ribs were now broken from the fall, and she was bleeding out from her arms. She was exhausted and cold, and she wanted to close her eyes and let go, but she knew she couldn't. She managed to get out of the culvert and stuck what remained of her arms into the earth of the canyon. The mixture of blood and dirt created mud packs that helped to slow the bleeding. She began to climb, and by the time she reached the cliff's edge, it was night. Singleton was gone, and the road was empty. Raising her mutilated arms above her head in a desperate attempt to stem the bleeding, she began to walk. She followed the distant sounds of a nearby highway for nearly 3 miles. In the distance, she spotted the headlights of a convertible, occupied by 2 young men. As they approached, she stood in the middle of the road, waiting for help. Instead of slowing down, the car sped up and intentionally passed her. Naked, smeared with dirt and blood, and with both of her arms severed, she was too horrifying to approach. Fortunately, she soon noticed another set of headlights. This time, it was an old truck. Inside was a couple on their honeymoon who had gotten lost. They stepped out of the vehicle and led Mary inside, and after a phone call, she was airlifted to the hospital. She lost over half the blood in her body, while the blood that remained became toxic. After intense surgery, Mary somehow survived the ordeal. Mary was able to provide a detailed description of Singleton to authorities, and he was quickly identified. Singleton attempted to twist the narrative, claiming Mary threatened to hurt him and that the two other hitchhikers were her true attackers. However, fragments of Singleton's troubled past, along with Mary's testimony, confirmed he was the attacker. Singleton's bad past began when he was stationed in Korea. A drinking habit developed, which would follow him throughout his life. His drinking problem ended his first marriage in 1971 and continued into his second in 1976. The rage and violence inside of him only worsened with the drinks he consumed and would be aimed at the women around him, ultimately ending his relationship with his daughter. His second marriage fell apart within 2 years after he refused to change his addiction and anger. This meant his attack on Mary would have occurred in the same year his wife, his outlet for abuse, left him. Years later, psychological evaluations conducted on Singleton found evidence of atypical psychosis, traits of personality disorder, and damage in all measurable regions in his brain. This included the frontal lobe, a region crucial for cognitive, emotional, and behavioral functions, which can be adversely affected by long-term excessive alcohol use. 6 months after Singleton's arrest, wearing the prosthetic she had been fitted for, Mary stepped into a San Diego courthouse and faced her attacker for the first time since he tried to kill her. While on the witness stand, she revisited her trauma, with Singleton seated just a few feet away. As she exited the stand, Singleton allegedly whispered to her, "I'll finish this job if it takes me the rest of my life." Singleton was found guilty of attempted murder, kidnapping, rape, sodomy, forced oral copulation, and aggravated mayhem, receiving a sentence of only 14 years in prison, the maximum penalty available in California at that time. Although Mary survived, her life changed immensely. Surgeons had to amputate part of her leg to save her right arm, effectively ending her career as a dancer. Upon returning to Las Vegas, her former friends distanced themselves, and her already strained relationship with her parents deteriorated further. Loud fights became regular inside the home Mary was so desperate to return to. She eventually left again, this time relocating to a small town in Washington. It was there that she got married, became a mother, and for a brief period, she found some semblance of peace. That was until Singleton got released from prison. Singleton served only 8 years and 3 months in prison before being released on parole for good behavior. From that point on, Mary became even more fearful, worried that Singleton would follow through on his word. She began to move frequently, too afraid to stay in one place for too long. With the stress of Singleton being released, and with the media breathing down Mary's neck, her marriage fell apart. Her financial situation deteriorated, relying solely on disability payments and insufficient or unpaid court settlements. Although Mary secured a $2.56 million civil judgment against Singleton, she was unable to collect, as he was found to be unemployed, in poor health, and with only $200 to his name. Within months, one of her homes was repossessed, forcing Mary and her 2 sons to live in an unheated, abandoned Arco station during the harsh winter months. It was around this time that Singleton followed through on his promise, but it wouldn't be Mary on the receiving end. By the late 1990s, Singleton relocated to Florida, having found no community in California willing to accept him. On February 19, 1997, he lured a woman named Roxanne Hayes into his home and brutally murdered her. Neighbors heard Roxanne's screams and called the police, but it was too late. Officers discovered her lifeless body on the floor, covered in blood and multiple stab wounds. Upon learning of Singleton's arrest, Mary traveled to Florida to testify on Roxanne's behalf. On February 20, 1998, the jury convicted Singleton, and on April 14, 1998, he received a death sentence. He spent 3 years in prison awaiting his execution, but died from cancer at the age of 74. Even with the death of her attacker, Mary's trauma overwhelmed her. Her nightmares were so severe that she injured herself, dislocating her shoulder while jumping out of bed as well as fracturing her ribs and breaking her nose. Eventually, Mary found solace in art, which became a vital tool for her healing process. Lacking the means to purchase advanced prosthetics, she created her own, using parts from refrigerators and stereo systems. She taught herself to draw and paint using her inventions and became an aspiring artist, but still dealt with the effects of her past. She still often woke up from nightmares, and her prosthetics often left her shoulders in pain. Nevertheless, Mary was in a better place, both physically and mentally. She currently lives in Vaughan, Washington, alongside her husband, Tony McGriff. She enjoys being an artist and got to be the mother she always dreamed about being.